In a couple of my recent guides, I showed how to deploy a Laravel application on a Ubuntu-based server running either Apache or Nginx. And this is a continuation of that. I'm going to now show how to set up your database. Specifically, we're going to be working with MySQL or the equivalent MariaDB. Step one in this process is we want to check that our server has a database system running. We could check for that using the system control status command, and we're going to be looking for MySQL. So I'm going to copy this command. I'm going to switch over to VSCode where I'm currently connected to my server. You can see I've got my terminal window open. That's where I'm going to run all of my commands. If you're not connecting to your server via VSCode, you could just do this in a regular command line or terminal window as long as you're SSH into your server. All right, so let's run that. And you can see in my case, it's reporting back that I do have a database server running. You can see that it is active. And specifically, I'm working with MariaDB on this server. The other thing you might see here instead of MariaDB is just a regular MySQL server. Either one of these would work for the process that I'm going to be showing. Now, if you run the status command and it tells you that it can't find any iteration of MySQL, whether it be MySQL or MariaDB, you're going to need to install it. And I have a separate guide on that. I'll link to it in the video description, or if you're following along in the notes, I also have a link here as well on setting up MySQL or MariaDB on an Ubuntu server. So that's where you're going to want to go first. And then once you do that and you come back and you run the status command again, you should see it's actively running as I've shown here. The third thing you might see when running this command is that you have a database server installed. This is not actively running. And if that's the case, run the system control command again, but this time replace status with start, and that will start up your database server. And then you can run the status command again and just confirm that it's actively running. Now, once you confirm that it's running, if we type the letter Q, we can exit out of that prompt. Brings us back to our regular prompt. And our next step is we now want to create a database that our Laravel application will interact with. The way I'm going to do that is via the MySQL command line. And to get to that command line, I'm just going to type the command MySQL. Now, before I run this, I want to note a couple things about how we're connecting to MySQL. In recent versions of MySQL or MariaDB, the authentication protocol that it uses by default is something called the Nginx socket. And the way that this protocol works is that any user we're connected to our server as is going to be the user we will connect to our database system as. So in my case, I'm currently logged into the server as the root user. So if I execute the MySQL command, it's going to connect me to MySQL as the root MySQL user. Now, let's talk about a couple different alternatives. Let's say I wasn't connected as the root user, but I still wanted to interact with my database system as the root user. What I would do is just prefix the command with the sudo command, and that would execute the MySQL command as that super user or the root user. And then finally, it's possible that you're not using that Nginx socket plugin. You are using a traditional password authentication approach, in which case your command would look something like this. You would say MySQL. You would indicate the user you want to connect as with the user flag. And in this instance, we do want to connect as the root MySQL user that has max privileges because we are going to be doing things like creating databases. And then we'd follow that up with the password flag. And what that would do is when we enter this command, it would prompt us for the root MySQL user's password. We'd have to enter that to get into the MySQL system. Now, if you have no idea what that password is, you've never set it, leave a comment below with the name of your server provider, and I could help provide you some guidance on how to locate that password or possibly reset it. All right, so long story short, there's a few different ways you got to authenticate yourself or can authenticate yourself with your MySQL system. In my case, I can simply just type the command MySQL, and that should give us a database prompt where we can run SQL commands. For example, we can start with the SQL command show databases and see what current databases exist on our system. And in my case, this is a brand new server, so I just see 4 default databases. These are just like system level databases for my MariaDB system. All right, now following that, let's create a database for the application we're setting up. The command for that is going to be create database, followed by the name of the database itself. I'm just going to call mine demo. I'm naming it after the application I'm working with. And then we can cycle back to the show databases command and just confirm that was created. So we can see that here. And that's all I need to do for the database setup itself, because in a moment, I'm going to go to my Laravel application and use my migrations there to create my tables within that database. Before I leave the MySQL prompt, though, I do want to create a new MySQL user that my application is going to connect as when interacting with this database. And for the command for that, let me go back to the notes and copy it. It's a little bit verbose. So we're down here. We just created the new database. Here we are. We're going to create a new user. This is our command. We're going to say create user. We're going to give our user some name. I always like to take the name of my application and just follow it with admin. Then we're going to indicate the server. In this case, we're working with a database system that's on our web server itself. So we're just going to self-reference that via localhost. And then we need to indicate a password that this user is going to authenticate as. And we are using a password here. It is different than what I was talking about a moment ago with that Unix socket authentication, because all of that was specific to SSH connections to our database. This is going to be connecting via our web server. So we are going to be using password-based authentication here. All right, so let's copy this command and bring it over and then edit it as appropriate. So you could change your username to match your application. And of course, you want to change and enter a secure password. For the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to call my password Hello World. Everything I'm doing here is temporary. I'm going to be deleting it after this video. If this was a real world database, I would obviously want a more secure password than that. All right, so let's hit enter. And then with our user created, we need to grant some privileges to that user. Coming back to the notes, the command we'll use is this one right here. We're going to grant all privileges on the name of the database we're working with. So you want to swap in your database name here, and then also swap in the name of the user that you just created that we're giving these privileges to. So I'm going to copy it and run it. And in terms of setup, that's all we need to do from the MySQL command prompt. So now what we want to do is turn our attention to our application and configure it to connect to this database as this user that we just created. And the way we're going to do that is via our environment file. So I'm going to open that up, and I want to look for my database related settings. For the DB connection, you could leave it as the default MySQL. This is true even if you're using MariaDB. We're using the underlying MySQL driver for this connection. For the DB host, it uses this default IP address, which for most users, this is going to work just fine as written. This is basically a self-referential IP address indicating that the database host we're connecting to is on the same server that our web server is running on. The only reason you would want to change this is if your database server was on some external server, you would want to indicate a different IP address here. Typically, MySQL is running on port 3306, so we will also leave this as the default. For the database, we want to change it to the name of the database we just created. So in my case, that was demo. Same thing for the username. We want to set the user that we just created. In my case, that was demo admin. And then we want to indicate the password we used. And in my example, that was just hello world. So I'm going to save those changes. And the first thing we can do to check that this application can connect to this database is let's go ahead and run our migrations. So I'm going to exit out of the MySQL command prompt using the exit command. And then within my project directory, we'll invoke artisan, and then we'll invoke the migrate command. And excellent, it looks like it ran smoothly on my end. But just to simulate what it would look like if you did have a problem, let's say I had the wrong password. So I'm just going to edit this, change to the wrong password, and attempt to run my migrations again. This time I'm going to get an error, and if we scroll through, we can see more details. So in this case, it's saying access denied for the user we're trying to connect to. There's some mention of the password here. So just look through any error feedback you get. It will usually point you in the right direction of where the problem is, so you can go back and check your settings. All right, so let me undo that, just get it back to a working state, and I can invoke migrate again. But this time, because I've already successfully run my migrations, this is telling me there's nothing new to do here, but I'm not getting any errors. The other thing you might want to do at this point, if you have seed set up to fill your database tables with sample data and you're working on a development context, you might want to run them. So I'm going to run mine. I'm going to say PHP artisan db seed, and it looks like all went well there. All right, so from the command line perspective, it looks like we're on track, but let's double check that this actually worked as expected. We have our tables created, we have our sample data there. The first way I'm going to check is by going back to the MySQL command prompt, and I'm going to select my demo database using the use command. And then with my database selected, I can take a look at some of my tables and the data within those tables. For example, I know that my migrations were set up to create a users table, and I had some C data there as well. So if I do something like select everything from users, we want to check that we got some output here. And if we scroll through here, we can see what looks to be user data as expected. A trick when you're working in the MySQL command line, typically we end our commands with a semicolon to indicate that's the end of the command. It'll allow us to run it. But if we're expecting a lot of data to be reported back, it can be really hard to read it in this format. So if we swap out that semicolon with a \G, it's going to separate and show us each row in this kind of condensed format, I guess you could say, and it just makes it a little bit easier to scan through the data. And again, we're just looking for healthy data here, matches our expectations based on the seeds. Just to show what my seeds look like, I'll bring up my seeders, the database seeder, and I just had one line of seeding happening here where it's creating 10 sample users. So that reflects what I'm seeing in the data behind the scene. All right, so that looks good. The other thing we can check is via the application in the web browser itself. So switching back to my browser, here's my application, and I had set it up with a route called users that just queries that users table and dumps all the results to the page. So we can see here the same data we were seeing via the command line, we're just seeing output in the browser. All right, and of course, in your scenario dealing with real-world applications, obviously your application is going to be a lot more interesting than this one, and you're going to want to run through, test the different features of your application, and make sure that any of the interactions with the database and the data that you expect to be there is working as you've designed it.